Imagine standing in Jerusalem sometime around the year 30 of the Common Era. You are a farmer from Galilee. You have walked 4 days to be here. Your sandals are worn through. Your back aches from the road. But none of that matters, because ahead of you, rising from the hill like something that fell from the sky, is the temple. The white limestone blazes in the morning sun so brightly it almost hurts to look at. The gold plating on the gates throws light in every direction. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian who saw it with his own eyes, wrote that from a distance, the temple looked like a mountain covered in snow. That is how bright it was. That is how enormous it was. Now keep looking. Do not look away, because if you adjust your gaze just slightly, if you lift your eyes from the sacred courts to the northern edge of the complex, you will see something that no theology class ever mentions. A fortress, stone walls rising even higher than the temple gates, Roman banners, red and gold, snapping in the wind above towers that overlook every square meter of the sacred courts below. The Antonia Fortress, named after Mark Antony, built by Herod the Great to impress his Roman patrons, staffed by Roman soldiers who could watch, from above, every pilgrim, every priest, every sacrifice, every moment of Jewish worship. A temple to the God of Israel, under Roman surveillance, from a building named after a Roman general. How did we get here? How does a faith that was born in the wilderness, that survived Egypt and Babylon in exile, end up encircled by the standards of Caesar? And more importantly, what did Rome actually want with it? Why not just destroy what you cannot understand? That is the question this episode is going to answer. Not by challenging anyone's faith, not by rewriting theology, but by mapping the system. The invisible machinery of politics, economics, fear, and calculation that ran underneath the religious life of first-century Judea. Because once you see those gears turning, you will never read the New Testament the same way again. Let us start with geography and a hard political reality, because that is where every system begins. Judea was, by Roman standards, a minor province. It produced no exotic grain like Egypt. It had no great river arteries like Mesopotamia. Its coastline was modest. Its population, historians estimate somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million in this period, was not exceptional by the scale of an empire that stretched from Scotland to Syria. By pure economic metrics, Judea should have been easy to administer and easy to ignore. But Judea was not easy. Judea was, in the language of Roman bureaucracy, a problem. The Jewish people had a relationship with their law and their God that Romans found genuinely difficult to process. Every other people Rome had absorbed had gods that were, in one way or another, negotiable. You could add Roman gods to a local pantheon. You could build a temple to Jupiter next to a temple to Baal, and most people would shrug and light incense at both altars. Romans were pragmatic polytheists. They genuinely believed that divine power could be absorbed, translated, renamed, and redirected. The God of Israel did not work that way. He was not one option among many. The Torah was not a cultural preference. The commandments were not suggestions. The prohibition against images was absolute. The Sabbath could not be suspended for Roman administrative convenience. And the memory, the deep, living, political memory of what foreign domination had meant in the past was encoded into the liturgy itself. Every Passover, every Shavuot, every reading of Deuteronomy reminded the people, we were slaves once. We were freed. God acts in history. Empires fall. For a Roman prefect sitting in Caesarea Maritima, reading dispatches about yet another prophet drawing crowds in the desert, that theological memory was not spirituality. It was a security assessment. The historian Martin Goodman, in his work on the Jewish ruling class in Roman Palestine, documents how Judea had already produced significant armed resistance well before the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. The Maccabean revolt was still celebrated. The memory of the Hasmonean kingdom, when Jewish rulers had actually controlled this land, was alive. Messianic expectation was not a fringe theological opinion. It was a widespread, culturally embedded hope that God would send a figure to restore Israel's sovereignty. Rome had seen what happened when that hope became an army. They would rather not repeat the experience. So the question facing every Roman administrator from Pompey's conquest in 63 BCE onward was not whether to destroy Judaism. Destroying it would guarantee the revolt they were trying to prevent. The question was something more sophisticated. How do you manage a system you cannot dismantle? The answer Rome arrived at was elegant in its cynicism. You do not touch the theology. You touch the institution. You find the point where faith becomes structure, where prayer becomes administration, where covenant becomes bureaucracy, and you put your hand on that lever. In first-century Judea, that lever had a name: the high priesthood. The office of the high priest was, by the standards of Jewish law as described in Leviticus and Numbers, a sacred and hereditary position. The high priest alone entered the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. The high priest wore specific garments, 8 pieces of sacred clothing described in extraordinary detail in Exodus 28, that were so symbolically charged that they were understood to carry atonement for the entire nation. These were not robes. They were the physical embodiment of a theological office. The ephod with its 12 stones representing the 12 tribes. The breastplate, the blue robe with golden bells at its hem, so that his movement before God could be heard. The turban with its golden plate bearing the words, "Holy to the Lord." Now here is what Rome did with that. According to Josephus, writing in his Antiquities of the Jews, the Romans took physical custody of the high priest's sacred vestments. They were stored in the Antonia fortress, the Roman fort, and released to the priests only on the major festivals when they were needed for the ceremonies. After each festival, the robes were returned, locked up again, under Roman guard. Stop and let that register. The garments without which the high priest could not perform the central act of Jewish atonement, the Day of Atonement sacrifice in the Holy of Holies, were kept by Rome. They were borrowed for the ceremony, then returned to Caesar's custody. This practice, confirmed by Josephus and accepted by most historians of the period, was not about the cloth. Rome did not need the cloth. It was about what the cloth represented, the message that legitimacy itself, the sacred authority to stand before God on behalf of the nation, flowed through Roman permission. And that was before you consider the appointment of the high priests themselves. Under normal biblical precedent, the high priesthood was hereditary, tied to the lineage of Aaron. But in the centuries of foreign domination, that system had been repeatedly overridden. By the time of Herod the Great, and continuing under direct Roman rule, the appointment and removal of high priests was effectively a political decision. Josephus records a remarkable statistic. In the roughly 107 years between Herod's rise to power and the destruction of the temple, there were approximately 28 high priests. Some served for decades, others for a single year. The removals and appointments tracked political winds, alliances and favors with an accuracy that had nothing to do with bloodline or divine calling. Caiaphas, the high priest during the trial of Jesus, served for approximately 18 years, an unusually long tenure. Historians note that this longevity almost certainly reflects how effectively he maintained the relationship with Pontius Pilate and the Roman administration. When Pilate was removed from office, Caiaphas was removed shortly afterward, not for theological failure, for political inconvenience. This is the machine beneath the ceremony. Every time a high priest entered the temple courts in his sacred vestments, he was also a man whose job security depended on keeping the Roman governor satisfied. That tension did not disappear when the incense was lit. It was baked into the institution. But politics requires money, and money is where the system becomes truly visible. The temple economy in first-century Jerusalem was, by the standards of the ancient world, a significant financial operation. Pilgrims came from across the diaspora, from Babylon, from Egypt, from Rome itself, from communities scattered across the Mediterranean for the three great pilgrimage festivals, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Archaeological evidence, combined with Josephus's accounts, suggests that during Passover, Jerusalem's population could swell dramatically from its normal size. Estimates vary widely among historians, and the upper figures given by Josephus are generally considered exaggerated by modern scholars. But even conservative assessments suggest the city received tens of thousands of additional visitors during major festivals. Every one of those pilgrims needed to participate in the temple economy. The temple tax, the half-shekel described in Exodus 30, was an annual obligation for every adult Jewish male. It had to be paid in the Tyrian shekel, a specific silver coin, because of its standardized weight and silver content. Even though Tyre was a pagan city and the coin bore pagan imagery, this created an immediate structural need for money changing. You arrive in Jerusalem with coins from your home region, Roman denarii, local bronze, Greek drachmas, and you need Tyrian shekels. The money changers at the temple courts were not a corruption of the system. They were a built-in feature of it. On top of the temple tax, pilgrims needed animals for sacrifice. Bringing your own animal from Galilee, a 4-day walk, meant risking that the animal would be declared ritually unacceptable upon inspection. The safer option, and almost certainly the more common one, was to buy an approved animal on site. Doves for the poor, as specified in Leviticus. Sheep and cattle for larger offerings. Archaeologists excavating Jerusalem have found evidence of significant commercial activity in and around the Temple Mount area. The scale of the infrastructure, the storerooms, the water channels for ritual purification, the sheer size of the courts as expanded by Herod, implies an operation managing thousands of transactions on peak festival days. Now layer Roman taxation on top of this. Judea paid taxes to Rome. This was not optional and not symbolic. The exact rates are debated among historians, but the structure included both direct taxes on land and produce and poll taxes on individuals. Tax collection was often farmed out, meaning local collectors paid Rome a fixed sum in advance and then collected what they could from the population, keeping anything above the baseline as profit. This system, well documented across the Roman world, created obvious incentives for abuse, which is why tax collectors appear in the New Testament as a distinct social category, people who were both economically useful and socially despised. The peasant farmer in Galilee, trying to make his Passover journey, was therefore navigating multiple simultaneous financial obligations: the tithe to the temple system, the half-shekel temple tax, the cost of festival participation, Roman land taxes, and whatever local tolls existed on roads and markets. The crushing weight of this layered system is, historians argue, a significant background factor for the social tensions visible throughout the Gospels. When Jesus overturns the tables of the money changers in the temple courts, an event recorded in all 4 Gospels, the action lands in a specific economic context. This is not simply a religious protest. It is a protest inside the central institution of a financial system that had become entangled with imperial power in ways many ordinary people found unbearable. And Rome, for its part, was content to let the system run, precisely because a functioning temple meant a stable revenue stream, an occupied population, and a predictable set of interlocutors at the top of the religious hierarchy. A temple full of pilgrims is a temple not full of revolutionaries. Which brings us to the most subtle part of the machine, the management of hope itself. Roman administrators in Judea were, from the evidence available, genuinely afraid of prophets. Not for theological reasons, for crowd dynamics reasons. Josephus records multiple incidents, entirely separate from the gospel narratives, of figures who gathered large followings in the wilderness, promising signs of deliverance, and who were met with military force by Roman or Herodian troops before their movements could gain critical mass. A man who could draw a crowd was a man who could become an army. The desert had a long memory in Israel, and Rome knew it. The response to this threat was not simply military. It was structural. The alliance between Roman authority and the temple leadership created what scholars sometimes describe as a collaborative security arrangement. The high priest and the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, had real jurisdiction over internal Jewish affairs. They could settle disputes, interpret law, maintain the calendar, manage the temple operation. Rome largely did not interfere with these functions. In exchange, the religious leadership served as a first line of social management. They were expected to identify and contain internal tensions before those tensions required Roman legions. When the Gospel of John records the deliberation of the Sanhedrin after the raising of Lazarus, it preserves a moment that reads very differently once you understand this system. The council debates what to do about Jesus, and Caiaphas says, "The text is explicit. It is better for you that one man should die for the people than that the whole nation should perish." This is not a statement of theology. It is a risk assessment. It is the language of a leadership that has internalized the logic of Roman provincial management, contained the potential disruption before it forces Roman intervention that could destroy everything. Whether one reads that moment through a theological lens or a political one, the structural reality underneath it is the same. The religious leadership of Judea had been operating inside a system where their continued authority depended on their ability to maintain order. That was the deal. That was what Rome had built. It is worth pausing here, because this is where the history becomes genuinely uncomfortable and where intellectual honesty matters most. None of this means that the faith of the Jewish people in this period was hollow or captured. Walk through the archaeology of 1st century Jerusalem. The mikveh, the ritual baths carved by the hundreds into the bedrock near the Temple Mount. The stone vessels used because stone could not contract ritual impurity. The obsessive material evidence of people trying, in their daily lives and in their kitchens and in their water supply, to live in alignment with the law they believed God had given them. And you find something that no political system could manufacture. You find conviction. You find a people for whom the faith was not performance. It was life. The system Rome built did not replace that faith. It sat on top of it, like a set of gears laid over a living thing. The faith kept moving. The gears kept turning. And the tragedy that runs under the entire 1st century like a fault line, is that it was very hard from inside that system to see where one ended and the other began. That is what made the message of someone who stood up and announced a different kind of kingdom so dangerous. Not dangerous to faith, dangerous to the machinery. When a voice from Galilee told crowds that the kingdom of God was near, that the real authority structure of the universe was not Caesar's but God's, that message landed in a specific context. It was not abstract theology. It was a direct comment on a system in which the institution of faith had been partially colonized by imperial power. Every time Jesus touched someone the purity system had excluded, every time he ate with a tax collector, every time he stood in the temple courts and spoke about the God of Israel in ways that implied the current management was missing the point, he was not just challenging religious convention. He was rattling the administrative architecture that Rome had spent generations carefully constructing. The gears could not afford to ignore that, and they did not. What we have been exploring today is not unique to 1st century Judea. The pattern: empire finds faith. Empire cannot destroy faith. Empire decides to manage faith instead, is one of the recurring architectures of human history. It appears in every century and on every continent. What makes the Judean case remarkable is how well documented it is, how theologically charged the stakes were, and how directly this system shapes the narratives we read in the New Testament. When you read about Pharisees and Sadducees, you are reading about factions navigating this system from different angles. When you read about tax collectors, you are reading about the Roman revenue mechanism at the street level. When you read about the chief priests coordinating with Pilate, You are reading about the collaborative security arrangement working exactly as Rome designed it. The text assumes you know how the machine works. Most modern readers do not, which is why so many of those scenes feel puzzling or opaque. Now you have the map, but the story does not end here, because there is something even more fundamental underneath the political architecture, underneath the temple economy. That narrow strip of territory, barely the size of a small modern state, squeezed between the Mediterranean and the desert, has been fought over by more armies, more empires, more civilizations than almost any comparable piece of ground in human history. Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, the Crusaders, the Ottomans. Why? Why this specific place? Why did empires keep colliding here? The answer is not theological. It is geographical, and it is as relentless and impersonal as stone. If Rome could use the temple and the faith to keep a province under control, what happens when you discover that the very geography of Israel seemed to conspire to attract armies, empires, and wars, transforming that territory into the world's ancient battlefield? Not by accident, not by divine punishment, but by the iron logic of where mountains meet trade routes, where continents converge, where anyone who wanted to control the ancient world had no choice but to pass through. That is the next hidden system,